Hi everyone, we're back again, and this time we'll be doing a little series on a topic that's been talked about a lot. And that topic is social justice. So I want to start by asking you, Rich, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you when you hear the term social justice?
First thing, probably at this point, protests and marches spring to mind. But as to what I think it means, I think it's more about everyone getting a fair share of the Earth's resources and being able to live with a sense of dignity, which, of course, I think is a positive thing. But of course, as you know, nowadays, it's become a very political term that can set people on edge.
Absolutely. And that's because different appeals to justice being made in the culture today can sometimes be conflicting. Like, for example, LGBTQ claims at times conflict with religious liberty claims. And you often see the term social justice warrior being tossed around negatively online. But I don't think the culture wars is something that we want to dive too deep into in this series. It's indisputable that at its core, justice is something that everyone wants.
Right. Yeah, thanks for framing it like that. That's how we're going to be talking about it. So let's start out by talking about what makes justice social. So there's a long philosophical tradition of justice going back to Aristotle, and then a theological tradition going back to Moses or earlier. The term social justice, from what I understand, originated in Catholic theology with the publication of Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, hope I'm saying that right, which is the first of a number of important Catholic social teachings, very much including Pope Francis' recent encyclical, which has a Latin name also, but I don't want to say it because I'm afraid I will sound stupid.
Well, I'm going to give it a go.
Oh, wow.
Fratelli Tutti.
Okay.
There, I did it, and I think it means all brothers, or as one joker on Twitter translated it, all the dudes.
All the dudes.
Anyway, there are many different definitions of justice, but what matters for us Christians is biblical justice, which is always social. It's for human beings living justly together. And biblical justice is very much about economic justice as well. And by that I mean inherent equality.
Right. And jumping in here on the theme of economic justice, there's this really interesting test case we want to talk about from the New Testament, the book of Acts. And it's not one of those comforting stories you hear from the gospel that you might have heard in Sunday school. It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira.
That story always terrified me.
Well, when did you first hear it?
I think my dad always read us Bible stories, but he brought it to us when we were a little older. Maybe I was in middle school, and I just remember being so shocked that this couple had no second chance. I mean, it was like, boom, you're dead.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and apparently it scared the people back then too. So for the people who don't know it, I think it would probably be good if we did a quick recap. Do you want to do that?
Sure. So this is in the book of Acts after the death and resurrection of Jesus and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. That event marks the new creation of a new community or a society of people sanctified or made holy by the Spirit. Huge stuff. The people called into this new society through the working of the Spirit voluntarily divest themselves of their wealth and share all their possessions. It actually says in Acts chapter 4, verse 34, "Nor was there anyone among them who lacked." But it's not just a warm and fuzzy socialistic utopia. And this is going back to the story Rich was referring to. Ananias and Sapphira, their husband and wife, they want to become members of this new radically just society, and they give a sum of money to the apostles to be shared. But then they hold back a portion of it. It was the money they had made from a recent land sale. And then when they're asked, is this all the money? They lie about it. And at the moment they tell this lie, they fall down and die. Actually, they both tell the same lie individually. Ananias before Sapphira. And there's this line the Apostle Peter says to Sapphira, "How could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also."
Yeah, it's pretty shocking stuff. Now, I don't think we should try to overinterpret the story and risk getting beat up by actual theologians. which we are not. But it seems pretty clear that Ananias and Sapphira's failing or sin is both against distributive justice to the poor and against God himself. And this is a point that many Christians, I think, tend to ignore or explain away. This story actually, I think, makes resoundingly clear God takes social justice, economic justice, very seriously among the people who have decided to follow him. It's not an optional thing.
It's not, and what's always impacted me about that story from the early church is that as a believer, we must honestly renounce all possessions, which then results in social justice. Our commitment to following Jesus' commands is a life of complete justice and equality. So that was the early church. Now jumping forward 1,500 years, the Anabaptists of the Radical Reformation, who we on the Bruderhof take a lot of inspiration from, were themselves inspired by reading the recently translated Bible at the time and the teachings of Jesus. And they took it on themselves to challenge the church's structures at that time, which had to a large degree been co-opted and actually actively involved in perpetuating economic injustice. So these were mostly folks from the lower classes, the serfs, the peasants, who were very strong in rejecting the view that property exists only for the possessor. And most of them rejected the concept of strict private property and believed it should be available to care for the poor and the less capable. Some took it even further, arguing that love abolishes private property altogether, which they then put into practice in full community of goods. But we'll talk about that in a later video.
Yeah, and it was a minority of a subset of the Anabaptists.
We're simplifying this.
Right.
Yeah.
And like that subset, we on the Bruderhof also renounce private property completely and devote our working lives, everything we have, to take care of one another and reach out to others because we believe it's the only way for social justice to become a reality. You know, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who supports injustice and inequality, or maybe I just have too positive a view of things. It seems to me that we all have a basic sense of what's fair and what isn't. I mean, even kids, it seems, innately know what's fair and what isn't. At least mine do. But the thing that's difficult is that for justice and equality to become a reality, people have to actually be willing to give up what is theirs or what they see as theirs. It's not going to happen through passionate Facebook posting and cosmetic adjustments. Martin Luther King kind of addressed this when he was writing for The Nation in 1966, and when he called civil rights gains emotionally satisfying but materially deficient. And that was primarily because black people remained in poverty, even as segregation laws were overturned and blacks were given voting rights.
I guess Dr. King saw some of those gains as surface level changes and people adjusting just the way they talked about race to be more socially acceptable, which I think is much easier than actually committing to what Oscar Romero called the violence of love, which he explains as violence that we must each do to ourselves to overcome our selfishness and such cruel inequalities among us. It's really poetic and beautiful way to put it. But I think we also have to acknowledge here that many people would disagree with our definition of a just society. Some would argue that they would be treated unjustly because their talents and hard work, for example, do more for society than others, and therefore their just desert should be greater. Our view clearly doesn't go there because we are all equal before God, no matter what our abilities, which is how we interpret true justice.
Right. One thing I do think is interesting is the fact that we are Anabaptists. But what's interesting is that we draw pretty heavily on Catholic social teaching for our understanding of what justice is, what economic and distributive justice are.
That's really interesting. I guess many or the most influential early Anabaptists were priests or monastics.
Michael Zattler and so forth.
Right, but they had another way to talk about this overcoming of ourselves, which I think is in some ways a better way to frame it than using the word violence, which brings to mind the flagellants during the bubonic plague who went around whipping themselves. The word the early Anabaptists used is a German word, like all good words, and it is Gelassenheit.
Say it again.
Gelassenheit. which means complete and voluntary surrender of self to God and forsaking all concern for personal benefits and property.
Just that word Gelassenheit, it sounds peaceful. It sounds like
Yeah, somehow the Germans
a glass of water. I don't know, something.
They managed to infuse the sound with the definition.
Yeah, onomatopoeia.
Impressive.
It is. And, back to Martin Luther King, he hints at exactly this idea in his Beyond Vietnam speech, which coincidentally was written by Vincent Harding, who was a good friend of the Bruderhof. And that speech, Beyond Vietnam, actually got Martin Luther King Jr. the 1960s version of being canceled. Because what he talked about was the need for a revolution of values to combat inequality. Basically, economic justice or distributive justice were ultimately the most important goals for him.
That's because social justice is incredibly revolutionary, but not just in a rah-rah, Facebook posting, Che t-shirt wearing way.
I still like my Che t-shirt. I think it's...
Well, the silkscreen job is amazing,
yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
I like that little star on his beret. Maybe you should wear a beret.
That's people have asked,
Yeah.
why do only the Bruderhof women have to wear a head covering? That could be...
That's a solid question.
Interestingly enough, that was the costume in the early community for men. They agreed to wear that the men should have a cap, and the beret was what was adopted. We should maybe go back to it.
Yeah, but then you'd all just give up on haircuts. Well, that's it for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll have more videos on this subject coming up soon.